Into the podium.
Thank you for coming. Solvik, I don't understand how, after you read what I said about the postmodernists, you could have liked it, since I argue that it's a form of mental illness. Anyway, thank you again for coming. I thought I would read a little something from the book, and then we can talk with each other afterwards. But first, I should tell you why I wrote the book. The title, Building a Bridge to the 18th Century, you like this title?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a play on President Clinton's oft-cited metaphor of building a bridge to the 21st century. So I asked myself, well, what would we take across the bridge? Obviously, high-definition television and all the other technical razzmatazz, but I thought we surely would want to take some good ideas with us. Well, Clinton doesn't mention any. But I did ask myself, well, where can we get some really good ideas? And I came to the conclusion we could find them in the 18th century. So I went back to the 18th century, and this is the century of Voltaire and Rousseau and Goethe and Kant and, of course, Jefferson and Franklin, all dead white males, I realize. But you probably couldn't find a more brilliant group of thinkers than those. And it was not my intention to argue in the book that we ought to become the 18th century, but only that we should use it for what it's worth and for all it's worth. And so in reviewing the 18th century, I tried to find ideas that we might be able to use in the 21st century. And so I have chapters on education, which I've always been interested in, language, progress, technology, democracy, and so on, drawing on ideas 18th century thinkers had, and to see to what extent they would apply for us in this century that's coming up. By the way, I discovered, as some of you probably know this, that the idea of progress was invented in the 18th century, and you might be surprised to know that the idea of happiness was invented in the 18th century, so those are good ideas to keep. One of the chapters I have is on information, and I thought I'd read a little bit about that to you, and then we could have a conversation. I'm reading now. I should like to start the idea about information by referring to a cartoon that appeared some time ago in the Los Angeles Times. The cartoon is about an amazing new product that has just come on the market. The product is designed to be better than any computer or anything that one could use a computer for, including the internet and web pages. The product is called a daily newspaper. And here are some of its selling points. It requires no batteries or wires. No maintenance contract is needed. It is lightweight, recyclable, and biodegradable. It is absolutely portable and will go with you on trains, buses, cars, airplanes, and even to bed. It is completely quiet, does not oink, buzz, or beep. No secret numbers, access codes, or modems are needed, and it does not affect your telephone lines. One has unlimited use of it for about $20 a month. It comes pre-edited for pornography, fraud, and typos. It requires no furniture space. And last but not least, the product does not in any way contribute to the bank account of Bill Gates. Now, I'm skipping over this, and there's some stuff, and getting on to a distinction I try to make among information, knowledge, and wisdom. And that's the part that I'll mostly concentrate on. What is information, and how much of it do people need? Obviously, information is not the same thing as knowledge, and it is certainly not anything close to what one might mean by wisdom. Information consists of statements about the facts of the world. There are, of course, an uncountable number of facts in the world. Facts are transformed into information only when we take note of them and speak of them, or in the case of newspapers, write about them. By this definition, facts cannot be wrong. They are what they are. Statements about facts, that is, information, can be wrong and often are. Thus, to say that we live in an unprecedented age of information is merely to say that we have available more statements about the world than we have ever had. This means, among other things, that we have available more erroneous statements than we have ever had. Has anyone been discussing the matter of how we can distinguish between what is true and what is false? Aside from schools, which are supposed to attend to the matter but largely ignore it, is there any institution or medium that is concerned with the problem of misinformation? Those who speak enthusiastically of the great volume of statements about the world available on the internet do not usually address how we may distinguish the true from the false. By its nature, the internet can have no interest in such a distinction. It is not a truth medium, it is an information medium. But in theory, at least, newspapers do have such an interest. And there are no editors anywhere who will claim that it is not their business to separate the true from the false. In fact, there is no problem older than this: how to know the difference between true and false statements. When Cain is asked where his brother is, and he pretends not to know, God knows that he knows. Indeed, he knew in advance that Cain would speak falsely. But for the rest of us, the matter is not so simple. Now, it's not my intention here to address the issue, although I do in a later chapter. Here I am addressing a problem no culture has faced before: the problem of what to do with too much information. One answer, of course, is to make oneself inaccessible to it. Some people do this, I among them. I do not have email, to take only one example, because it would make me the target of carloads of messages, almost all of which have no fundamental bearing on my life. I have developed other means of withdrawal, as have many people, although it is not easy to do this. In America, especially, one is thought to be peculiar, if not worse, if one sidesteps the onrush of information. But I'm not here concerned with individual strategies. My focus here is on how at least one medium, the newspaper, can assist in helping everyone overcome information glut. To say it simply, newspapers should, for a start, get out of the information business and into the knowledge business. Now, what do I mean by knowledge? I define knowledge as organized information. Information that is embedded in some context. Information that has a purpose, that leads one to seek further information in order to understand something about the world. Without organized information, we may know something of the world, but very little about it. When one has knowledge, one knows how to make sense of information, knows how to relate information to one's life, and especially knows when information is irrelevant. Now, it's fairly obvious that some newspaper editors are aware of the distinction between information and knowledge, but not nearly enough of them. There are newspapers whose editors do not yet grasp that in a technological world, information is a problem, not a solution. They will tell us of things we already know about and will give little or no space to providing a sense of context or coherence. Let us suppose, for example, that a 14-year-old Palestinian boy hurls a Molotov cocktail at two 18-year-old Israeli soldiers in Jerusalem. The explosion knocks one of the soldiers down and damages his left eye. The other soldier, terrified, fires a shot at the Palestinian that kills him instantly. The injured soldier loses the sight of his eye. All of this we learn of on television or from radio. The next day we are told about it again in the newspaper. Why? The newspaper will add nothing unless it can tell something about the meaning of the event, including why this event is in the newspaper at all. There are at least 40 wars presently going on someplace in the world, and we can assume that young people are being killed in all of them. Why do I need to know about this event? Why is what happens in Jerusalem more important than what happens in Ghana? Will this event in Jerusalem have an effect on other events? Is this something that has happened many times before? Is it likely to happen again? Is someone to blame for what happened here? And in this context, what do we mean by blame? Now, a newspaper that does not answer these questions is useless. It is worse than useless. It contributes incoherence and confusion to minds that are already overloaded with information. After all, the next day, someone will be killed in Bosnia, and the day after that in Indonesia, and the day after that someplace else. So what? If I were asked to say what is the worst thing about television news or radio news, I would say that it is just this, that there is no reason offered for why the information is there. No background, no connectedness to anything else, no point of view, no sense of what the audience is supposed to do with the information. It is as if the word because is entirely absent from the grammar of broadcast journalism. We are presented with a world of ands, not becauses. This happened, and then this happened, and then something else happened, and then something else happened. As things stand now, at least in America, television and radio are media for information junkies, not for people interested in becauses. I might pause here to remark that one of the most crucial functions of social institutions, the church, the courts, the schools, political parties, families, is to provide us with the becauses. That is, help us to know why information is important or irrelevant, socially acceptable or blasphemous, conventional or weird, even true or false. Some of these institutions do not do this work with as much conviction as they once did, which makes it especially necessary that a knowledge medium be available. And there is no more fundamental requirement of a knowledge medium than that it make clear why we are being given information. If we do not know that, we know nothing worth knowing. But there is something else the newspapers must do for us in a technological age, and it has to do with the word wisdom. Now, I wish to suggest that it is time for newspapers to begin thinking of themselves as being not merely in the knowledge business, but in the wisdom business as well. Now, you may be inclined to think I'm going too far here, but I wish to define wisdom in a way that will make it appear to you entirely practical. I mean by wisdom the capacity to know what body of knowledge is relevant to the solution of significant problems. Knowledge, as I've said, is only organized information. It is self-contained, confined to a single system of information about the world. One can have a great deal of knowledge about the world, but entirely lack wisdom. That is frequently the case with scientists, politicians, entrepreneurs, academics, even theologians. Let us take, for example, a story about cloning. It is mere information to tell us that scientists in Scotland have cloned a sheep, and that some scientists in the United States claim to have cloned a monkey. We will be provided with knowledge if we are told how cloning is done, and how soon we may expect humans to be cloned, and even something about the history of attempts at cloning. But it would be wisdom to advise us on what system of knowledge we need in order to evaluate the act of cloning. Science itself can give us no help in this matter. Science can only tell us how it works. What can tell us whether or not we should be happy or sad about this? What can tell us if there are policies that need to be developed to control such a process? What can tell us if this is progress or regress? Now, to begin to think about such questions, we would have to be referred to the body of knowledge we call religion, or the body of knowledge we call politics, or the body of knowledge we call sociology. Knowledge cannot judge itself. Knowledge must be judged by other knowledge, and therein lies the essence of wisdom. There are, I have learned, children starving in Somalia. What system of knowledge do I need to know in order to have some idea about how to solve this problem? I have learned that our oceans are polluted and the rainforests are being depleted. What systems of knowledge can help us to know how these problems might be solved, or the problems of racism and sexism, or the problem of crime? Now, if you are thinking that this sort of thing is accomplished in newspapers on the editorial page, I say it is not. Editorials merely tell us what to think. I am talking about telling us what we need to know in order to think. That is the difference between mere opinion and wisdom. It's also the difference between dogmatism and education. Any fool can have an opinion. To know what one needs to know to have an opinion is wisdom, which is another way of saying that wisdom means knowing what questions to ask about knowledge. I do not mean, of course, technical questions which are easy. I mean questions that come from a world other than the world from which the knowledge comes. And nowhere is this kind of wisdom needed more than in the story of technology itself. That story, the changeover from industrial machinery to electronic impulse, hasn't been well covered by most newspapers, in part because most editors do not have a clue about what questions need asking about technology. They seem unaware that significant technological change always involves a reordering of our moral presuppositions, of social life, of psychic habits, of political practices. The closest editors ever come to conveying a sense of the non-technological meaning of technological change is in their speculations about economic consequences, which I might say they usually have wrong, mostly because they consult only with economists. Wisdom does not imply having the right answers. It implies only asking the right questions. Consider what most journalists might do if given a chance to ask Bill Gates questions. What would they ask? What is his latest project? How does his software work? How much money will he make? What mergers is he planning? Well, I would probably ask him the same questions because, in fact, judging from his book, The Road Ahead, Gates may be the last person likely to have answers to the moral, psychological, and social questions that need to be asked about computer technology. Whom would we want to interview about that? And what would we ask? Consider who was interviewed by journalists during the U.S.-Iraqi war. On television and radio and in the press, generals, experts on weapons systems, and Pentagon officials dominated. No artists were interviewed, no historians, no novelists, no theologians, no school teachers, no doctors. Is war the business only of military experts? Is what they have to say about the war the only perspective citizens need to have? I should think that weapons system experts would be the last people to be interviewed on the matter of war. Perhaps the absence of any others may be accounted for by saying the first casualty of war is wisdom. Just another couple of paragraphs. Let's stay awake now. I can envision a future in which what I've been saying about wisdom will be commonplace in newspapers. I cannot envision exactly how this will be done, although I rather like imagining a time when, in addition to op-ed pages, we will have wisdom pages filled with relevant questions about the stories that have been covered, questions directed at those who offer different bodies of knowledge from those which the stories themselves confront. I can even imagine a time when the news will be organized not according to the standard format of local, regional, national, and world news, but according to some other organizing principle. For example, the 7 deadly sins of greed, lust, envy, and so on. Do I ask too much of editors? Too much of newspapers? Well, perhaps. But I say what I do because we live now in a world of too much information, confusing specialized knowledge, and too little wisdom. Journalists may think it is not their job to offer the wisdom. I say, why not? Who can say where their responsibilities as journalists end? This much we can say and ought to. The problem to be solved in the 21st century is not how to move information, not the engineering of information. We solved that problem long ago. The problem is how to transform information into knowledge and how to transform knowledge into wisdom. If we can solve that problem, all the rest will take care of itself. Thank you. Thank you. That was from the chapter on information. Now we can have a conversation if you like, or some questions, of course. Yes, sir.
Do you think that alternative media start to provide some of the remedies you talk about regarding wisdom and information?
What are alternative media?
Let's say a not-for-profit news organization, not driven by advertising or owned by, uh, you know, owned by a big corporation or political interest. The kind of things that people go to the internet for as a remedy to a newspaper's shortcomings.
Yeah, well, you obviously think it does, right?
Well, I was hoping at your opinion. I mean, I can see for myself how it works, but you've got a much better background, and I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about it.
Well, I mean, if to the extent that, well, for one thing, we could have sources or media that are not tied to advertising, I think we have a gain right there. Television, for example, certainly not an alternative medium, but in America is about selling audiences to advertisers. So that restricts what it does and what it wishes to do. The more variety we can get to the structure of our information or knowledge industries, I think the better off we've got to be. One of the reasons I'm not as enthusiastic as some about the internet is that that when most people talk about it, what seems to excite them is that it makes information available quickly and in great value. So I mean, what's the big deal? In 1840, this would have been a big deal. I mean, we had the problem in the beginning of the 19th century. How to get more information to more people fast and in diverse forms. And we began to address that problem in the late 1830s and early 1840s with the invention of telegraphy and photography. And for 150 years, we have addressed this problem. So here's the good news. We solved this problem. Congratulations. So from my point of view, people who say computer technology in the 21st century will really give us access to a lot of information fast and in diverse forms, such people strike me as reactionaries. They're trying to solve a 19th century problem that's already been solved. So I may have missed something here, I admit.
Will
but what?
Information irrelevant?
What?
Will it make it irrelevant?
Well, yes. I mean, much of it is. And that, see, this, in the 19th century and for all the centuries before then, we were faced with the problem of information scarcity. Now, this is the first time in human history when we have the opposite problem. Information glut. Overload, whatever you want to call it. And we haven't addressed this problem. So now it could be that in the end, computer technology will help us solve that problem. But not if we think about it as the beginning of the information age, as many do. I think if we begin to think about computers as the end of the information age, that it is an instrument for helping us discriminate, well, put it this way, helping us get rid of information. To put it bluntly, information has become a form of garbage. So our problem now is not how to get it, but how to get rid of it, most of it. Or else it'll drive us crazy, which I think it's doing. So it's not even the question of our having even more alternative media, but media that help us make a move toward wisdom, as I defined it here.
Yeah, I guess my view on that was going to be that it's not so much that computers are wonderful per se for bringing us all this information, but that there's kind of a wisdom shortage in that the delivery mechanism frequently filters out viewpoints.
You mean through censorship? Is it?
Through paid advertising, and so if we're telling people that a certain kind of food isn't good for them, that message won't reach people through a television that has a food advertiser, for example. I guess it's the variety.
Yeah, although I'll get to you in a second. But I'm not so much interested in that sort of I don't know what we'd call it, censorship or propaganda as another kind. I mean the average American kid at age 21 has seen about 650,000 television commercials. So the television commercial becomes the single most voluminous source of socializing the young. I think it has to be studied. It's not so much what is being censored, but if one just looks at the world that the television commercial especially presents, it's really quite depressing. All problems are solvable. They're solvable fast, and they're solvable through the use of some drug or machine. I mean, that's sort of the basic message. One of my students a few years ago was the president of an important advertising company, and he was trying to get the account for Scope. You know the Scope mouthwash. And a typical Scope commercial in those days would go for about 30 seconds. But of course, it was a very interesting narrative. The first 10 seconds, the problem was stated. You'd see, say, a young woman at the end of a date, and she tilts her head expecting to be kissed, and the young man says, "Well, Barbara, don't call me, I'll call you." So now we know the problem. The next 10 seconds, we basically got the solution. We'd see Barbara with her roommate in her apartment. She said, "I don't know, this always happens to me. I don't know what I'm going to do." And her roommate said, "Well, I know what the problem is, Barbara. You have bad breath. You must use Scope." I'm not sure if it's actually Scope, but some mouthwash. And then the last 10 seconds, you get the sort of moral. You see Barbara and this young man getting off a plane in Hawaii or something, and you know that things have worked out. She bought the right mouthwash, and this is... So all problems are solvable fast through a chemical. So I remember saying to my student, I said, I've got a good idea. You want to get this account. Offer them a different kind of approach. The first 10 seconds can be the same. Barbara expects to be kissed, and she's not. Then she goes in, that's the next part that's a little different. She goes in, she says, I know this always happens to me. What am I going to do? And then the roommate would say, "Well, I know what the problem is, Barbara. You're boring. You haven't read a book in 5 years. You don't know the difference between Mozart and Bruce Springsteen. It's a wonder that a young man would spend 10 minutes with you." And then Barbara would say, "Yeah, what can I do?" And the roommate would say, you notice his commercial's really going on, would say, well, go take a course. Join an independent bookstore or something. And go to some concerts. And Barbara would say, well, but this is going to take a long time. And the roommate would say, yes. And the commercial will end with the roommate handing Barbara a copy of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents or something. So, and of course, we had a big laugh about it because it's not that, I mean, it's obvious you could never get a commercial like that, but that commercial act that I made up contains a point of view that would be hostile to almost every message that every other commercial is giving. I mean, it would take an act of rebellion for anyone to suggest that all problems are either not solvable, or if they're solvable, they take a long time, and you cannot solve it in any case with just a swig of something. Anyway, I wanted to get you, yes.
Yeah, I guess I was interested in having you amplify some of the sociological arguments of why media functions the way it is. Been fascinated with your writing since Amusing Ourselves to Death, which to me at the time sort of suggested that the technology itself determines how we use it. You give the example of, a TV set could be used as a light to read by, but in fact it's a lot more useful as a medium for 30-second spots. I was wondering what you think of the kind of arguments like what Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman give in Manufacturing Consent about political control and ownership of media outlets.
Well, I think my point of view is more sophisticated than theirs. In this sense, there is no question that when we in America turned our television over to, say, Procter and Gamble, I mean, I'm using that as a metaphor for all sorts of limits and ideological biases flowed from that. So I'm with them. In fact, one of my colleagues, Mark Crispin Miller, has been doing studies, of who owns what in America. And basically, it's what, Viacom and Ted Turner and a few others. And it'd be idiotic to think that that does not influence public opinion and ideological biases and so on. On the other hand, I think it's a mistake to underestimate the power of the structure of a medium to dictate to some extent how it's going to be used. I mean, if you build a 747 jet, you're not going to use it to carry the garbage from one city to, or a suburb to a city. The structure of the thing itself tells you to use it for intercontinental travel. With television, as you mentioned, I mean, people watch television. They watch it, and what they like to watch are fast-moving, exciting, exotic imagery. Television is at its best. Now, I'm being televised now. This is your basic talking head, which all TV directors hate, and which no one is going to watch if a good show is on at the same time. And who could blame them? But I'm exaggerating a little. I suppose if you have, even if you have more interesting people than I am here, people will watch to some extent. But we can't underestimate what television is structurally, what it does. Television is not a book and does not do for people what books do. It's different.
That's what you're saying here.
Yes.
In the 18th century, they were better read. They read more.
They did read more.
They had that greater wisdom.
I think I agree with you there, too. Where are we going with this? Yeah, sure, they read more because, I mean, Tocqueville says in Democracy in America, the politics of America is the politics of the printed word. Well, what could we say today? The politics of America is the politics of the televised image. I mean, you know, I wrote, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, I wrote about the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Right.
Well, I mean, you folks in Illinois should know all about this. And when they went around the state, it was not uncommon for Lincoln to speak for 3 hours, Douglas for 3 hours, and then Lincoln to take an hour for rebuttal. Then when they went to the next town, they do it the other way around. Well, what do we have today? I mean, Barbara Walters will say, this next question is for you, President Clinton. What do you think is the cause of the trouble or difficulty in the Middle East, and how can it be solved? You have 2 minutes to answer this, after which Senator Dole will have 1 minute to reply. Well, and Americans call this a debate. Talk about the change. They will actually say, did you see the debate last night? This shows you how far we've slipped.
Perhaps because nothing else is available, though. It's a product which is sold to us, and it's called a debate. So that's what we call it.
I mean, there are a lot of changes in language that the new media. But what I'm saying is that we must not underestimate the fact that every technology has a bias in its structure. It has an epistemological bias. It's almost saying, do this thing with me. Use me in this way. Now, that doesn't mean we have to. We could have, still could, forbidden campaign politics on television. We could have not permitted television commercials directed at little children. There are all sorts of things we could have done and still could do, I suppose. But so I think it's both. I mean, I think the economic structure, here's the way I look at it. Maybe this will help on this. I think a technology is to the brain. You getting this? Good.
It all the way.
A technology is to the brain as a medium is to the mind. So what I mean is that a technology like the brain is a piece of hard wiring. A medium like the mind is a use to which you put the hard wiring. So the technology of television is pretty much the same all over the world. But the use to which television is put can be different. But again, we must never underestimate just as we know you can't do everything with the brain. It's limited in its structure. You can't do everything with certain technologies because its structure is limited. Yes, sir, and you okay? Yes.
We'll have a little anecdote for you first.
Good.
And then
Please forgive my drinking like this. It's ugly, but there isn't a glass up here, so.
A few years ago, I was talking with a well-known economist from Harvard and told him that I went to the University of Chicago, and he said, oh, that's really a wonderful place to go to school if you want to know the way things worked in the 18th century. And he was putting me down, but I suppose now I can go back and tell him that it really was the best place all along. what I would like to know from your talk is where you get this notion of wisdom from in the 18th century. In particular, I mean, if you think of just the Enlightenment, it would mostly be concerned with what you call knowledge, and wisdom might seem to come from, classical Greece or whatever.
Well, I mean, the definition I gave of wisdom in what I read is I made that up.
So it's really building a bridge to Postman.
No, but one of the reasons I would say that there was more wisdom, perhaps, in the 18th century than now, is that there was less specialization. That is, the smart people were not just one thing and did not focus all their energy and intelligence on learning that thing. Most of our wise or our smart people today have that sort of specialized focus, whereas the great philosophers of the 18th century were very broad in their learning and were able to bring to bear on any question many perspectives. I mean, if you just look at
Samuel Johnson.
Is an excellent example. I was going to give a little different one, but that's a good one. I was thinking of the Federalist Papers, who was John J. Madison Hamilton. First of all, the Federalist Papers were published in a New York newspaper. I mean, you just could not imagine a newspaper today publishing the Federalist Papers. But if you read the papers, you see that these men are drawing on almost every available source of knowledge of that time to make their arguments. I mean, if Clinton gave a speech and drew on, Cicero, let's say he quoted Cicero. First of all, you would know someone from the University of Chicago who was an advisor said, put this in, right? I mean, you know that Clinton would not normally make reference to Cicero for anything, or even de Tocqueville. So I think that is one of, if he said, you go to the University of Chicago and you'll be wise in the 18th century way, I think that's sort of a compliment. But you took it as an insult.
It was intended as a joke.
What did you do to the guy? You just let it...
I laughed.
Yeah, you laughed.
What are you going to do?
Yeah. By the way, I would, let's see if I have this right. I have it someplace in here. I think with the exception of George Washington, all the presidents, vice presidents, and secretaries of state, I think like the first 6, but I have to check that, were lawyers. Which only goes to show the decline of the legal profession, because in the 18th century, lawyering was considered a learned profession. The lawyers knew about Cicero, and now, of course, it's entirely different. Yes, sir.
I'm curious in telling why you chose these 8 different topics to write on, and looking back at the 18th century, why these were the main chapters?
Well, the question is why I chose those particular. Yeah. One answer is that there are 2 or 3 of them that, especially education, children, that I've been writing on. It's always been part of my interest. So that was, and then, well, actually all of them are part of my interest. The chapter on language which is sort of the favorite part of the book. I mean, to write it, because we're talking about the postmodernists, and I really do think that the French influence on what might be called postmodernism now is very destructive. So I was angry about that. And this is not to say that I'm anti-French. As a matter of fact, I think the American professoriate, not at the University of Chicago, though, is asking their students to read the wrong Frenchman. I think they should be reading Diderot and Voltaire and Rousseau and Condorcet rather than Baudrillard and Foucault. I don't know if you know these. But the idea, and I have this real snotty line in the book, that Baudrillard says someplace that not only can language not represent reality, but there's no reality to represent. Now, my snotty line, which I put in parenthesis, is that this at long last explains the French indifference to the invasion of their country by the Nazis in the 1940s. They just didn't notice them. Someone told me to take that out, but I kind of liked it. So I've always been interested in language. I've written some books about language, and the Enlightenment thinkers knew perfectly well what the limits of language were, what the dangers of language are. You can quote them endlessly, and they would sound very much like some of the modern postmodernists concerning the limitations of language. But not for a moment, well, maybe with one exception comes to mind, did most of them believe that language was not capable of representing to some degree what we call reality. And they would deny that all reality is a social construction. Blood does circulate through the body. And it doesn't make a difference what some Frenchman says about that. And if you have the AIDS virus, it's going to make you sick, most likely. And that's not a social construction. So you can see I'm getting a little worked up about this.
What you're saying is reality is reality. So
well, some of it. Some of it. Of course, there are words we use to speak about reality that that have no specific reference except through other words. We know that. But the 18th century was the great move toward inductive science. Inoculations against smallpox began. Stephen Hales figured out how to measure blood pressure. I mean, they finally were able to manage language so that they could make the beginnings of the great scientific revolution. So that's why I picked language and some of the others, because I've always written about them, and I tend to be pretty interesting. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you, of course.
Why is it that we think of computers as, or like getting all the information packed in will be vital to our children's,
Why?
like education plan?
Well, I don't.
I know, but why is it that society is very optimistic about this?
Well, Americans love technology, and have been quite willing to reorganize their lives, social, psychic, political, whatever, to accommodate the demands of new technologies. And I think we've made a little mistake here. I think we have confused a technological innovation with humane progress. we see them as the same. And I think that's very limited, and this is not a mistake they made in the 18th century. The beginning of the 18th century was a time of great scientific and technological growth. But right in the middle of that century, Rousseau wrote a famous essay in which he raised this question: does science and technological growth pervert our morals or extend our morals? And he said it perverts our morals. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but he raised the question, and that question remained vital throughout the rest of the century, not only by Rousseau, but others, right into the 19th century, where the great Romantic poets, chief among them Percy Shelley, but Blake and Wordsworth, raised the same question. Is science the same thing as humane development or growth? And they said no. Now, so that's an argument I think we have to start to have here in the 21st century. That's a case, you know, what I said at the beginning, looking for ideas, debates, arguments they had in the 18th century that we should renew. I mean, Vice President Gore, who is... yes, he invented the internet, and he's sort of a friend, and if he's watching on C-SPAN there, I'm going to vote for him if he gets nominated. But when he talks about the information superhighway, he likes to stress the point that it would make possible each of us to have maybe 1,000 television stations.
It seems also that because it's an interactive, like computers and interactive technology, we think if they're interactive, that'll give them some good. But I think that, like, if there's so much information jammed and, like...
Who is this guy? he should be here. Yes, go on.
Distractions, because if it's all graphic and just so much information, I don't think it gives good.
And it's entertaining.
Yeah, and it should be used as, I mean, learning can be entertaining, but it should be used in a wise way, applying to our everyday reality. And I think also that
There's nothing I could say that could top.
And I think also that while we're progressing in the last 20 years into technology and, like, computers, we've also not been progressing because we're going into a virtual progressment. Not like where it doesn't seem like, you know, we're learning very much science now about...
Well, you know, there have been studies a couple of summers ago. I think his name is Todd Oppenheim. Maybe Oppenheim. No, Oppenheim, I think. Did a cover story in the Atlantic. It was, he had reviewed schools that were using computer technology at wired classrooms and so on. And he was trying to find out if kids who had that available to them in their schooling were doing a lot better than kids who didn't. And as I recall, he found the only advantage the kids had who had the computers available in their classrooms was they learned quicker how to use computers. You know, which... But whether or not they knew, they wrote better, read better, spoke better, listened better, knew more history, knew more anything, he couldn't find any evidence for it.
It looks much more as a substitute to real-world learning than...
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, and then yes.
I'd like to go back to your definition of wisdom.
Wisdom.
Because I'm getting sort of confused. It almost feels illusionary to me. And let's go back to the Federalist Papers. each side had a completely different idea of what wisdom was. Was it the debate itself that was wisdom, or what we saw 100 years later from what they said? Is that the wisdom? Where I can't see where you're coming from. I can't see the wisdom.
Well, see, what my definition comes down to is that wisdom entails your capacity to ask the right questions about what's happening. And in order to do that, you have to have broad knowledge, not only of the field that is under question, but of other systems of knowledge to bring to bear on it.
A philosopher king, that's it?
What?
Your answer is a philosopher king? The only person who could have that much knowledge?
No.
Who could have that much knowledge?
You.
In
You're
today's
asking people to
society,
have
who can know
skepticism.
medicine, physics?
What do I know?
Yeah.
Michael D. Montaigne.
You think that someone could have consulted you about the U.S.-Iraqi war? Would you have had any questions to ask?
I'd have opinions, but again, they'd be worthless.
Well, no, I said questions.
Sure, I'd have questions.
What would you ask?
About the Iraqi war?
The U.S.-Iraqi war. There it is. We're about to kill some people, and now you're being interviewed. Do you have any good questions to ask?
No, honestly, I don't.
All right. You're not a wise man. But I mean, I think there are many people who did. And they didn't have to be philosopher kings. People who had moral objections. They knew something about morals. They knew about it from their religion. People who had even biological objections based on biological issues because they knew something about that, and so on. There are a lot of people who had questions like that. They were not philosophers kings, but they were using knowledge that they had of some other system to bring to bear on this system, war.
Transfer of knowledge.
Yes. Now, there was someone, behind you.
My
Yes.
comment was probably going to summarize this and ask a question, but you may have already answered it. I had long believed that a person was responsible for being open to a wide variety of information sources so as to become knowledgeable and then ultimately become wise. And you had said earlier in your comments that you had hoped that newspapers and other media outlets would become knowledge purveyors, lead to help all of us get to wisdom. And my question was, do you think an individual can do that, can achieve it?
Well, in a way, and it goes back to what you were asking about, what I read to you, although I don't say it, but at least not there, I don't think, is a good argument for the liberal arts. That, I mean, I know the tendency in America now is to give students more specialized training and education. And even in high schools now and below, they want to train kids for specific jobs. But I think there's a very good argument for the liberal arts in what I was saying. To get back to your point, that you have to provide people with a multitude of perspectives, whether it's philosophical or theological or medical. By the way, you say medicine, what can you know about medicine? You know, one of the things we're discovering is that people actually do know a lot about medicine from what has happened to their own bodies. And they can bring to bear knowledge when they're addressing some issue that is not directly about that. Did you want to say, well, I know we're going to end soon, but you and then you, and we'll go watch television. Yes.
It seems to me that one aspect of the 18th century was the Enlightenment ideas of religion, that it was personal, and that there was a trust that individual conscience would lead people in the right direction. Implicit trust in conscience. That's something that we don't have very much in this society anymore. And I wonder about connection between wisdom and conscience, Whether you looked at that at all?
Well, you know, the question of religion in the 18th century is extremely interesting. For example, obviously Tom Paine's attack on churches of all kinds would make one think that he was an atheist. He hated churches of all kinds. But he says in that book that he believes in one God and that there will be an afterlife. Most of the, say, American philosophers were called deists. Now, I don't know if we think of them as atheists. Jefferson wrote a version of the New Testament, which is available, by the way, in a fairly new edition that I've seen, in which he removed all of the, what he thought fanciful content, retaining only the ethical content. So it's hard to say exactly how they believed. I think most of them believed in God, or believed in a higher being of some sort. They had a transcendent conception. But they were almost all suspicious of the church, of churches of any kind. And here's Voltaire, I love this. Wretched, he's talking about priests now. Wretched human beings, whether you wear green robes, black robes, cloaks and clerical bands, never seek to use authority where it is only a question of reason, unless you wish to be scoffed at throughout the centuries as the most impertinent of men, and to suffer public hatred as the most unjust. You have been spoken to 100 times of the insolent absurdity with which you condemned Galileo, and I speak to you for the 101st, and I hope you will keep the anniversary of that event forever. Would that there might be graved on the door of your holy office, here 7 cardinals, assisted by minor brethren, had the finest thinker of Italy thrown into prison at the age of 70, made him fast on bread and water because he instructed the human race and because they were ignorant. Well, I mean, not many could write. The institution of religion exists only to keep mankind in order and to make men merit the goodness of God by their virtue. Everything in a religion that does not tend toward this goal must be considered alien or dangerous. And Paine, the sentence I referred to was, I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. Here's Diderot. Men will never be free. Oh, this is tough. Men will never be free till the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. I mean, these guys were tough, right? But the thing is that on the more fundamental question, did they believe in some higher authority? I think we could say most of them did. But oddly enough, the one I'm most suspicious of, I don't know if suspicious is the right word, but the one I think may not have, was Benjamin Franklin. And everyone would say, if you were to ask to name one who didn't, they'd say Tom Paine. Good. But I think maybe it was Franklin. But I do have a chapter, by the way, and I'll end with this, which is, well, there was one more in the book, which I call narratives. And what I mean by narratives are stories, not like novels and plays and so on, but some large, transcendent story that helps to give people a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives. And of course, the great narrative of Genesis has done that for many people. There are also national narratives. For those of us in America, I'm not sure we believe in many of them anymore, but that America is a light unto the world, and we have an obligation to teach the world how to live in a democratic way. Now, I'm not saying the rest of the world appreciated that story, but it meant a lot to us, and gave a lot of meaning to Americans, helped bind them. And then, of course, the melting pot story. It's a great story. This is a place where people of all races and religions can come together to live as one people. Now, it's a story. There's a lot of, we never achieve it, but it's something we say we must, it's a story that we're trying to achieve. And of course, the great Protestant ethic, the surest way to win God's favor is to deny yourself everything, to work hard and never be happy. This is, it's a great, really, we can build, you could, with people believing in that story, they can build railroads, they can build an empire. Now the story is, the surest way to win God's favor is to buy things. It doesn't matter what you buy, just buy things. Because he who dies with the most toys wins. It's not a very good story. Yes, sir. Last question.
Actually, I have a question out of your chapter on narratives. If I could frame it around this one sentence
Okay.
as a focal point. You're right. It is also assumed that as we proceed into a postmodern world, we are bereft of a narrative that can provide courage and optimism. We're facing what Václav Havel and others would call a crisis in narrative. And elsewhere in the chapter, you talk about the best narratives having an element of transcendence embedded in them. One question I had as I was reading this, and maybe you could help answer it, is what do you think contributed, or what were some of the factors that contributed in this century to the great narratives losing their purchase on people?
Well, there are a lot. I mean, keep in mind that the three great transcendent narratives of this century were Nazism, fascism, and communism. They were intended to give meaning and purpose to millions and millions of people all over the planet. So what do we learn from this? That there can be narratives that are catastrophic if people believe them. I mean, the Third Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years. It lasted exactly 12. And the great narrative of Marx and Lenin lasted, what, about 70 years? That quote from Václav Havel is very crucial to that chapter, because part of it was when he addressed Congress. You know Havel, and he spoke about this to Congress. He said, we are facing what he called a crisis in narrative. And woe unto us if we cannot find a new one that, unlike Nazism, fascism, and communism, has the capacity to help us grow humanely and decently and with confidence and with a sense of hope. People need that. You know, what's the first question a child asks when he or she has language? Where did I come from? And sooner or later they're going to ask, what's going to happen after I die? Has anyone here stopped asking this question now that we're all grown-ups? We still want to know an answer. Now, Science said, I have an answer. Where did we come from? It was an accident. What's going to happen to us at the end? Well, probably go by an accident. What the hell kind of answer is that? I mean, who can live a life with that? The accidental life is probably not worth living. So science is not exactly, and I have a certain feeling, I must say, I don't want to be too misunderstood about this, about those people in Kansas and in other places who don't want to abandon the great story of creationism for evolution. Because they're not yet sure that this great tale of science is powerful enough to make people live a decent life and with courage and hope. So they don't want to give that up yet. And it doesn't quite do it for them when you say, well, but your story of creationism isn't true. And this one is true. Part of the power of a narrative is that it's not exactly true in the scientific sense of true. I mean, is the great story of Genesis true? Well, it probably doesn't measure up to the standards of science, but it's true in another way. There's a truth to it in that it may speak to the human heart. I mean, Rousseau says someplace here that progress is a matter of the human heart, not human machines. Well, how do we make ourselves better? What kind of story? I'll end with this. I have a son who's he's an astrophysicist. He works for the Hubble telescope people, you know, and a few years ago, he and a colleague looked, I think it was further in the universe than anyone had looked so far. Now, since then, I think others have looked. So I asked him one day, I said, Mark, you saw further in the universe than anyone. Did you see any sign of God? So he said, well, Dad, if you believe in God, you don't have to look through that telescope, which I thought was a wonderful answer. I immediately told my wife, we made a real mensch here, right? It's a wonderful answer. That believing in God it's a different kind of truth. So I don't know where we're going to find the new narratives. We usually depend a lot on our writers, our artists. I sometimes think Steven Spielberg is trying to help us get a new narrative that you see in E.T. and what was that other movie? Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where it's almost as if he's saying he wants us to develop a consciousness of ourselves as crew members on the planet Earth. That we have to be stewards of the Earth because we're all on the same spaceship and we're all crew members. And I think it's a wonderful idea. I think, by the way, young people, I've noticed, seem to be more taken by that idea than most of us old guys and gals, you know. So we'll see what the future. But I do think that if Clinton wants to talk about building a bridge to the 21st century, let him say what we have to do in the 21st century is find a story that we can all believe in at some level, that binds us, that gives us a sense of confidence and hope. And what could be more important than that? Except watching television. Thank you all.
Neil Postman chairs the Culture and Communication Department at New York University. He's also a media critic and author of 20 previous books. Building a Bridge to the 18th Century is published by Alfred A.